People trapped inside. That and breaking news, Evansville, Indiana, where a car has smashed through a diner and injured 10 people. That's all ahead and less more. Changes everything on Studio B. First from Fox at 3 o'clock, it's now gotten very serious. Another day of urban warfare on the streets of a major world capital. Waves of violence and lawlessness in Cairo for a second straight day. The Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak has just given an interview to ABC News' Christian Amanpour, and he says he fears chaos in the streets of Egypt if he steps down. He reportedly says he would like to leave office, that he's had enough after 29 years, but he cannot. Also today, some alarming events apparently at the hands of the Egyptian government itself, Hosni Mubarak's Egyptian government. The Interior Ministry seems to be widening its crackdown on international media and human rights workers. Many dozens of journalists are under arrest now in an apparent effort to remove the witnesses to the battle with anti-government protesters. Men whom protesters say wore plainclothes police officers who shut down many news outlets that had been operating in buildings overlooking Tahrir Square. It's an effort to stop information from flowing to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, possibly trying to win back the people's favor for secretly tipping this uprising out of control. A government spokesman calling that fiction. But there are reports that more than 24 journalists are now under arrest, others roughed up, others beaten and robbed or harassed. And yesterday, our own Fox News correspondent Greg Palcott, though we did not report it at the time because we feared for his life, was confronted by several protesters, our Greg Palcott. Here's one of the last reports that our man filed moments before the attack.
Seeing about 50 rocks literally in the air back and forth. And now I'm looking at a crowd, a total crowd of pro-government protesters, about 2,000 or 3,000. The activists, a band of about 500, and they're moving back and forth. Right now, the anti-government forces, activists, protesters, have the upper hand, and they're moving towards us. But it's a standoff, and if no one is going to intercede, either they're all going to give up after 4 or 5 hours of this, right, or something worse will happen.
Well, something worse did happen. The protesters did not give up. Greg and his cameraman Olaf Wig were severely beaten. They ended up in the hospital. They stayed the night in the hospital. Their condition was described at the time as, quote, grave, unquote. But now, after some terrific medical attention, they're out of the hospital. We'll get you updates on Greg Palcott and Olaf Wig as we get them. Meantime, a Greek newspaper is reporting a protester stabbed one of its correspondents in the legs. The New York Times reports 2 of its journalists were reportedly arrested or, quote, taken into protective custody, as the government put it. 6 journalists from Al Jazeera satellite television network were detained, their equipment taken away. CNN, Anderson Cooper, ABC with another, NBC with Richard Engel, and the story goes on and on. So what are we witnessing exactly? We witnessed 4 or 5 days of peaceful protests of people who can't get ahead, with an unemployment rate of 40% and a 50% rate of living below the poverty level, and a dictatorial rule over them with no chance of anything in the future. At long last, they watched a neighboring country rise up, and it worked, and they said, we too will try, and they did. And they did so peacefully. And they went to the streets and said, please give us another chance at another kind of government. Please give us hope for the future. But they couldn't get it. And as their peaceful protest continued, all of a sudden, yesterday, out of nowhere, without warning, a group of pro-Mubarak demonstrators came in and began to kill people. They attacked journalists. They locked them up. They stopped the message from getting out. At the same time, how did they do it? The prices of everything in Egypt have skyrocketed. People haven't been paid for a week. Children don't have food, as we discussed here yesterday. And the government, we are led to believe, offered them money to come out and attack journalists and attack those who were peacefully protesting in Tahrir Square. And last night, in the middle of the night, they brought out a smokescreen to try to separate the two. And now Hosni Mubarak, after all these days, grants an interview to Christian Amanpour and says, I would love to step down, but it's too dangerous. There's chaos in the streets. There's chaos in the streets because his government made there be chaos in the streets. They have shut down the message. And as one columnist for a newspaper in the United States said today, I wonder what they don't want us to see. Look at our pictures coming out of Tahrir Square today. Our correspondent was hospitalized. Our crews were removed. This is the APTN, Associated Press Television news feed. Yesterday during this hour, we watched what was happening in Tahrir Square, didn't we? And then this is the picture coming into us from Reuters news agency, on which we and people around the world rely. These are the pictures that we get out of that country, where their people are being killed and suppressed for saying we need democratic freedoms, the rights that were granted to us by our Creator. Today, we cannot bring you those pictures, and we do not know what's happening in that square. Joining us live from